Well, thanks a lot. We should get started now. Thanks a lot for coming. As you know, of course, we're in the middle of one of the closest electoral races in recent Brazilian democracy, whereas the fight between the Workers' Party, the PT, and the PSDB of the center-right is nothing really new in Brazilian politics. The fact that we had a political outsider almost coming to the second round of the elections says a lot about what has changed recently in Brazil. Marina Silva, of course, of the Brazilian Socialist Party, who despite being a long-standing political figure in Brazil, does not belong to one of the heavyweight political parties. She came close to the second round, a remarkable ascension in the polls and a remarkable decline in the polls as well. The recent emphasis on the sexy new term, new politics, put forth by the Marina Silva candidacy, also reflects recent changes in Brazil's political scenario and society. The fact that new politics agenda was adopted to some extent by the now main opposition candidate Aécio Neves indicates that the idea of systemic change contained in that project of new politics has not died with the Marina candidacy. So I think our intention here today, so close to the second round, is not to examine who is going to win, but what is new and what is old in the Brazilian political scenario and how it reflects changes in society. And for that, we'll go to a very distinguished panel today. Marcos Freitas, who comes all the way from São Paulo, is a professor of international law and international relations at the Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado, FAAP, in Brazil. He has worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, Occidental Petroleum, and Ernst & Young's Latin American Business Center, and he's currently a member of the Expert Advisory Board at Frontier Strategy Group. Dr. Anthony Pereira, on the other hand, is our neighbor. He's director of the Brazil Institute at King's College London, has taught at the New School for Social Research in New York, and has been a visiting professor at Harvard and the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts University. I will pass the word for Anthony to start.
Thanks, Antonio. I'll try to do three things in my brief comments. One, talk about how this election, how it fits in with longer historical patterns of state formation in Brazil. Try to contrast the PT and PSDB positions in the election, and talk a little bit about the tone of the campaign, because I think that's something striking for those of us who've watched other presidential elections, how not only how tight this election is, but how bitter some of the vitriol is about it. I'm afraid to go onto Facebook these days to see what people have posted. It is funny, it is odd for me as an outsider. I mean, I'm not a Brazilian. I'm looking from quite a great distance at Brazil to be so involved in following the election, because so many Brazilians seem to want to go the other way and to get away from them. We noticed that there was a very high rate of abstentions and null and blank votes in the election. If you look at some of the surveys of young people, there's one that I saw recently that said that something like 59% of young people aged 16 to 30 would prefer that there were no parties at all in Brazil, and getting very tired of the kind of the sort of back and forth. So it is odd as an outsider to be so fixated on the election, but I am. So without further ado, to talk about state formation. And I like to say that I'm not in the news business. I can't compete with journalists in terms of getting news out. I'm in the olds business. And in some ways, this election looks like a very old conflict in Brazil. There's an interesting piece by a historian recently, Christian Lynch, who talks about the conflict in the empire between Sacaremas, advocates of state involvement in the economy and a strong state to centralize the nation and to push Brazil out of its state of backwardness, and the Luzias, the more cosmopolitan, liberal parts of the country that were more in favor of free markets and more laissez-faire. And in some, so we had that in the 19th century. There was a conflict in the Vargas period, and in a way we're seeing it again here in this election in 2014. I don't want to exaggerate the degree of historical continuity or oversimplify, but in many ways we can say that we've seen this debate before. The one thing I would say to qualify that is that I believe the debate about the state is taking place within the confines of a state that since the 1930s has been what I would call, well, it's been a developmentalist state since the 1930s. I think since the 1990s, it's become what you could call a neo-developmental state. In other words, it's not repeating the policies of import substitution, industrialization, but it is a somewhat different form of capitalism than we're used to seeing in the Anglo-American world. So there is a big role for the state banks. There is a labor code which highly regulates the labor relationships. And there is a consensus about these things. And you see that in the presidential debate. So Arminio Fraga was just the other day explaining, well, when I said that the BNDES had to have a smaller role, I didn't mean it should have no role at all. I agree that there should be a BNDES, there should be a development bank, it should be providing credit, and so on. And so I think what we're talking about is a policy space, an area of policy divergence that is not as large as you might think from reading from following the actual campaign rhetoric, and that's just because of these historical patterns that are very difficult to completely get away from. So I wanted to make that point. So one characteristic of the state is this neo-developmentalism. Another important characteristic of the state is that there's a very strong consensus in favor of some form of social democracy, and you can see that in the statements of the PSDB and the ASIO campaign. They are not a sort of Tea Party, anti-tax and spend, anti-redistribution. That's not their campaign. They're saying that we have to restructure the foundation for economic growth in order to continue the redistribution, in order to continue the social programs. So it's not a debate about the desirability of more social programs. The other thing, the other fundamental characteristic of the Brazilian state, which I won't talk about that much because it's not that fundamental to the campaign, but there are some campaign issues that touch on it, and that is that the degree of violence that the state uses to maintain the social order is relatively high by international standards. So this is a state where the police use quite a bit of violence. There are a few issues involved with sort of public security, but I won't go into those here. So what are the two main candidates offering? In some ways, an election is a struggle over what the primary question should be for the country. And I would say that Dilma would like that question to be, who do you trust to preserve the gains in terms of social inclusion that we've had over the last 12 years? She would like that to be the question because she would like to say, we can't trust ASIO to maintain those gains. I think for ASIO it would be, who do you trust to govern the economy? Not only in terms of a sound macroeconomic strategy that gets away, that surmounts this real problem that the Dilma government has with the markets, but also one that's less corrupt. So in some ways, the battleground in terms of posing those two questions is the so-called Class C. Those people in households where the income is between 1,000 reais and 4,000 reais a month. And the Class C doesn't look the same in each different region of Brazil. So if you go to the north and the northeast, there are likely to be more people in the Class C who agree with the framing of the Dilma campaign. And as you go south, into the southeast and the south, there are more people in Class C who are really more worried about macroeconomic issues and would say, that question that ASIO is asking, that's the one that I think should be asked in this campaign, and I'm going to vote on that basis. So, you know, the latest polls we still have within the margin of error, so there's not much I can say about who's going to win. It just seems like it's just too close to call. But I do think it's interesting that those questions are so different. There's one thing I would say in terms of the view from here, because I think there's a natural affinity between the business community in London and the ASIO campaign. And historically that's been the case, that the liberal cosmopolitan view has a lot more adherence in a place like London than the neo-developmentalist view. But I think sometimes there's a somewhat depreciative, I would say, or a somewhat pejorative description or dismissive attitude towards the accomplishments of the PT over the last 12 years. So sometimes you hear people saying, well, Fernando Henrique was a government of reforms and not programs, and the PT government has been a government of programs but not reforms. Well, if you consider people who have benefited from the rising minimum wage and from social programs and from increased access to education and so on, that sounds a little dismissive. In that what people are saying when they say that is the fundamental reforms are the kinds of economic reforms that happened under Fernando Henrique, that lowered tariff barriers, that facilitated foreign investment, that facilitated mergers and acquisitions, and those are the really serious, responsible changes that the country needs to start paying attention to again. So issues such as rising minimum wage, Bolsa Familia, ProUni, these sorts of programs are not really reforms. They're not as serious, they're not as important. Well, we could debate what's a reform and what's a program, but my point is that sounds a little bit dismissive to the ordinary voter. And I think viewed from here, we probably have to take a little more seriously some of those claims about what's been done over the last 12 years. The question, of course, is where to go from here. What do Brazilians want going from here? I think on the vitriol, the tone of the debate, I'm persuaded by an analysis by Leonardo Avritzer, who talks about why the middle class is so divided in this election. And one of the things he says, he uses some Datafolha polling about where they take they divide the middle class into three segments: the high, the intermediate, and the lower middle class. And according to Datafolha, the high middle class is 67% for Aécio. And the intermediate and lower middle class are 53% in favor of Dilma. Quite split, almost 50-50, but slightly in favor of Dilma. And this makes a lot of sense, because one of the things that's happened in Brazil over the last 10 years is that with the rise of the minimum wage and with the social programs, the cost of services has gone up. It's gone up 104% in the 10 years between 2004 and 2014. And one of the things that strikes a middle-class visitor to Brazil, or used to, when I used to go to Brazil, is that the high middle class in Brazil, and to some extent the intermediate, had a standard of living that was not comparable to the middle class in the U.S. and Britain. Why? Because they had cheap labor. They had access to cheap labor. They had people who could work in the home, who could serve them, who could come and do all the repairs and all the services, and it was very cheap compared to the cost of those services outside of Brazil. And that's changed. You're now getting a convergence within the middle class, where even people in the Class C have access to education that they had not before, their salaries have gone up, and so on. And so there is something of a status displacement, I think, of the high middle class. So you remember the incident a few months ago when someone from PUC-Rio said, this person in the airport, they should be in a rodoviário, they should be in a bus station. Why am I sharing an airport with someone who looks like they just came into a bus? And I'm not saying that the campaign is all about that. Clearly, there are policy positions that what we're talking about economic policy and so on. That's there as well. But there is a status anxiety, I think, that makes the tone of the campaign quite bitter. And of course, on the other side, you have the PT claiming this is all about social class, which I don't think it can be reduced to. It is also about region. It's also about historical experience. So I think I'm reaching the end of my time, but I wanted to mention something else about what we're likely to see after the election, because I do worry about that a little bit. I think it would be easier, because of the position of the markets, it would be easier for Aécio to take over than it would be for Dilma. That's my gut feeling, because the relationship between people in the markets and the government is so strained now. And if Aécio were to win, there would be certainly euphoria among business people here in Britain, but also generally in Brazil. And you could press the reset button, and you could say, okay, now we'll have a plan from Emílio Fraga about what to do in terms of the fiscal side. There'll be confidence, and people will have more reassurance to invest. And it'll be harder for Dilma, because I'm not sure that she will be able to do as much as Aécio would do to calm the markets. And also the PT vote, the PT seats have gone down in the Congress. There's been fragmentation. There are more parties in Congress than there used to be. So coalition management will be more difficult. And there'll also be a very resentful opposition that feels we were cheated out of this election. I don't know how strong that feeling will be. My sense is that probably those feelings will be overcome. We have seen continued foreign investment into Brazil. It's not as if there's been an absolute, there's been a brutal shutdown in foreign investment going to Brazil. There tends to be a pragmatism about Brazilian business, that they will just get on with it. But there is this danger of a kind of lingering bitter feeling. As someone said, I think in the event we did at Freshfields, if Dilma wins ugly, or if she scrapes through, what does the economic and political scenario look like? It doesn't look that good. So I wanted to stop there and listen to Marcos. Thanks, Antonio.
Thank you, Anthony. Regarding Facebook, some people in my timeline, they posted, presidential campaigns pass, but friends remain. So apparently, they need to remind people of that, it's quite worrying. Marcos.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I was just thinking, I was listing lessons learned in this election, and I kept writing all the ones that I could track regarding this election. I'd say that a word on the PT and PSDB. I think they're turning more like the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States, too similar when it comes to programs. I cannot tell too much of a difference between one and the other, even though the markets perceive them differently, but many of the programs are similar to each other. So you don't see Aécio saying that he's going to go against Bolsa Familia, or you don't see him, going to privatize certain institutions. We do see that there is a major similarity in the plans, even though they're going to say that they're very different from each other. But in that sense, I do see them coming closer in that aspect. Now, this is shown by the extreme similarities between the candidates. Right? There is not much of a difference between Dilma and Aécio when it comes to their political plans and what they want to say. Now, the second lesson I think we learned in this election is that Brazil is becoming too much of a government of names and not of projects. And that's a major challenge that Brazil is facing. The fact that Aécio Neves announced that his Minister of Finance would be Arminio Fraga, basically puts a lot of pressure on the person. And I was just telling in a previous panel, if this Arminio Fraga were to have a heart attack, what would Aécio do when it comes to his finance policy? So we do see that there is a little too much emphasis on the names. Who is going to be the next, even the next Minister of Finance, and the whole issue there is because of the trust factor that Anthony raised very well. Now, one thing that we learned is that how much you emphasize an issue will determine whether this is true or not. And you do see that happening in the panels and the discussions, and so you do see in the debates this is a present element. The truth, or whether it's true or not, will depend on how much emphasis is put on that issue. So you do see that sometimes they're discussing about the fact that they were hiring family members, and then Aécio brought the family of Dilma, and then all of a sudden the issue is no longer there. So that's a thing that we have learned from this election. One thing that we also learned is that the Brazilian people are deciding the election in the very last moment of the election. In the past, we used to have a more definition, like 3 weeks before the election or 4 weeks before the election, you'd have an idea of what was going on. Now we're leaving for the very last minute, and I was saying we're turning like the French, right? Always the split between 49-51, and that's an issue that Brazil is going through right now. Perception prevails over the facts. That's an interesting lesson that we're learning. Lula had a major impact in Brazilian ideology because he basically killed ideology in Brazil. When we had one of the presidents of the political parties, PSD, said that his party was neither from the left, nor from the right, nor from the center. that kind of shows that the ideological debate in Brazil has disappeared. And even though you might have Marina Silva as a phenomenon for a third way in this scenario, you don't see that becoming a much stronger issue in Brazilian politics. Now, corruption has also been an issue that has been raised in the election. And apparently the interesting thing that has happened is that Brazilians talk a lot about corruption, but they seem not to be doing much about it. Because both sides have problems. You know, PSDB has problems in the state of São Paulo, in Minas Gerais, you know, the PT has problems at the federal level. So there is this idea that corruption is all over in all the political parties there. Now, another thing that we learned is that these electoral polling in Brazil really needs to be improved. You know, if I were going to ask an institute, a Brazilian institute for polling, today would either be Sunday or Saturday. So that's a major problem that the polling companies need to face. Now, that's one of the important lessons that we still need to improve this a lot. Even though the most reliable one, if you're keeping track of Brazil, I'd say that the most reliable one is always the Datafolha. That's where you have a better idea on the trend, but you really don't understand what is going to, you know, how they failed in the last election. Now, the June manifestations that we had in 2013 haven't been reflected in 2014. And how's that? Well, when you know that Brazilian political cycle in Brazil starts on October 1st. And if you're affiliated with a party, that means that you're going to, that party, the candidates that are going to be launched by the party need to be affiliated by October 1st. Well, since there was no major shift in the political scenario in Brazil, what you actually see is that even though there was major manifestations, the political parties did not reflect necessarily what was going on in the streets. So there is a major mismatch between the political parties, the internal politics, and the realities that the country is facing. One thing that we also learned is that, but there is a sense that Brazil should change. And interesting enough, this change has been greatly emphasized on the presidency of the country. Now, if you look, for instance, in the state of São Paulo, we have had the same PSDB government for the last 20 years, and nobody understands why. Because, there's water problems, you do see this, but, it has kept hold of the state of São Paulo for a very long time. Then the issue becomes here the following. People decided to concentrate that change should be in the federal government, at the federal level. And one of the reasons is that people don't like Dilma very much. Now, the reason people don't like Dilma very much is, if you get to know Dilma a little better, you're going to enjoy it even less. Now, she's not the kind of person you invite for happy hour, right, Ambassador? Alan was ambassador in Brazil with Dilma. He probably didn't invite her for many parties, right? She's not the most, pleasant person there. But one thing that we also have learned is that the world is interested in Brazil, but the world doesn't understand what's going on in Brazil. So you do see, like, the economists say, oh, we should support ISU, but I think they did the same thing 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And they didn't get it right. So, they should stop doing this. Foreign policy, not a part of the political debate in Brazil. And they even had only one discussion in one of the debates, which was about the port that Brazil built in Cuba. And that was the only discussion, and it was raised by one of the candidates there. Now, one problem that this election shows is that political parties in Brazil need to learn what democracy is. That hasn't happened at the political party level. The political parties in Brazil have owners, and these owners decide when the timing is for each one to change things. So you do see that, for instance, PSDB, where Aécio Neves is, he has been fighting to have that position for many years, because it's basically been either Serra or Alckmin, and they have been alternating this. And all the political parties in Brazil have, this kind of ownership that needs to be changed. Now, Bolsa Familia will continue because that's a good electoral base. And remember, this was not started by, even though Dilma keeps saying it started in her government, Bolsa Familia, the whole concept of these transfers started in the Fernando Henrique era, and it does have an impact on the fact that the electorate looks differently upon those who have created the program. Now, what we do see, another lesson that I think we learned, is that the PT is not connected with this new middle class in Brazil. It's interesting that if over the last 12 years, there was this ascension of 50 million people, and the PT discourse was good for addressing these people who were in the E, D, and E classes. But once they became C and B, their political discourse is not adjusted for this new class. Why? Because their demands are different, right? And they expect the government not to be a burden. What is happening is that the new middle class in Brazil is actually finding out the cost of being Brazilian. And when we say the cost of being Brazilian, I mean, public services that do not work, health programs that do not work, all the challenges that Brazil has. And that's an issue that PT is no longer connected. So I think if I could be a prophet here, prophesy, I'd say it's the end of the PT cycle in government. Lula could come back 4 years from now, but that would be the end, I think, of this whole program, because people are getting better in their in their economy. We realize that Dilma is a horrible manager. She was sold to Brazil as the big manager by Lula, and we found out that she likes to micromanage, and she doesn't do that very well. So that's one of the lessons we learned. And I wanted to add 2 or 3 more things. We do see that the dictatorship that Brazil had basically killed the right movement in Brazil. We don't have a party on the right in Brazil. People are very embarrassed to say that they are on the right, so we don't see that as a result of the dictatorship. And people associate the right with the military and all the bad politicians from that time. What we do see happening nowadays is that the evangelical revolution in Brazil is the place where the new right will come from. So if you look into the political discourse of Marina, even though she's on the left, but she really made it more palatable to a discourse in the right, because that's where her supporters from the evangelical movement come from. And you even have a pastor as a candidate. So you do see that if you're thinking about ideology being reinserted into the Brazilian politics, you will see that the evangelical movement will play a major role. Now, when it comes to our Congress, if you think that Brazil was doing bad when it comes to political parties, we went now in Congress from 22 political parties to 28 political parties. So I think we're doing worse than Italy in that sense. But you do see that PMDB, which is always in government, will still be in government no matter what the government is, right? They're because they have the majority. They elected they had elected 70. No, they elected 71 new House representatives, and they have control of the Senate. So you cannot exclude PMDB from the government, no matter what the government that will come. What you do see, which is an interesting aspect too, is that PMDB still will be the party that will hold more governorships in Brazil, more than anyone else. We're going to have the second round also this coming Sunday in 14 states. And they are actually participating in 8 of the states. So there is a high likelihood that PMDB will still remain as Brazil's greatest political force, even though people dislike PMDB a lot. Now, to finalize this, I wanted to say a word on the future as we see it. If PT loses, if Dilma loses, I think they're going to be a much better opposition than they were before. And why is that? Well, because they have learned that once you're in government, there are certain things that you need support. And there have been so many scandals that they're going to be afraid of being the ones that raise the flag. If PSDB were to lose, they should learn how to become an opposition, because they haven't done that. And they haven't learned to be an opposition, and that's why you see that the political discourse is not there. We still have the Lula factor. I was saying at the Foreign Service that Lula is an important player in Brazilian politics. He's really, this election kind of showed that he's not as strong as before, but he's still a major political force. We call him the Brazilian version of Mandela, and even said that the difference between Mandela and Lula is that Mandela spent 27 years in jail, and Lula hasn't yet. So we're just,
he spent a month in jail.
Yeah, just 1 month. He still has a little bit more time. So, but just give him, if Petrobras becomes a major scandal, he could do a little bit more. And the whole issue there is that no matter who comes after this Sunday, they will need to restore trust. And trust in the economic agents, and that the economy is going to do well. I think that the Brazil is a great country, and there is a positive approach for the future. If we invest, if we do more investments in infrastructure, the country will grow. And even though what the real issue, the real challenge that Brazil faces is how to solve its competitiveness problem. Now, and I do not see this being reflected in either candidates. How are we going to make sure that Brazil becomes a competitive country? That's the challenge, and that's the issue there. And to conclude, I'd say that when it comes to foreign policy, no matter who the president is, the idea of BRICS, which is consolidating steadily with the new development bank, is a good thing for Brazil. Because it brought Brazil to a more outstanding position in the world community than it was before. Whenever we talked about Brazil, we always talked about crisis. Now, BRICS does give Brazil a more important and a more relevant role in the world. And so we always say that we should be very thankful to Jim O'Neill for coining that term and talking about BRICS. And so our relationship with China will tend to improve, and I think now what we need to do is a Brazilian reading of China and a Brazilian reading of India and Russia. Now, because our reading has always been done through the eyes of the Americans and the Europeans. Now, if you want to improve the relationship, we need to do that with different eyes. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Marcos. I hope that they will listen to this recording, both political parties, because there were a lot of recommendations there, and that's good.
I might go to jail after too.
So, well, we have now some space for questions. Do you have any questions? I will.
What is the position of either candidate as to the current crisis between Russia and the West, whatever we call West?
Marcos, you're a foreign policy expert.
Well, the relationship between Brazil, we're in BRICS together, and Brazil has clearly made, has really clearly taken the position of appeasing anything that deals with Russia. Now, we oppose Kosovo. Kosovo is not recognized by Brazil as a country because of our relationship with Russia. And we do see that there is a good relationship between Dilma and Putin. So I do not see that changing or Brazil opposing or using BRICS as a way to tell the Russians that they're misbehaving or anything like that. So the relationship between Brazil and Russia will remain like this, as it is, and I do not see that changing. And I ask you, it all will depend on how much he values BRICS as a forum for Brazil to insert itself internationally.
I'll make the second question. I think during the protest last year, we saw a criticism of the PSDB that they were not responding well to the protests as the opposition force, that they didn't galvanize, propose alternatives to what was there in the middle of all those protests against the management of the country. So they didn't earn enough political points as they should have, perhaps, as the opposition during that mass protest movement. At the same time, you said that the PT is not very well aligned to the middle class. So I'm wondering if there are substantive issues being discussed in the elections, because we see a lot of corruption accusations, and even small corruption accusations like building an airstrip, and every single detail of the candidates' records are being scrutinized. But the substantive debates perhaps are not as present as they should be. So are there any substantive issues like the economy or foreign policy that have stood out during this campaign? And what do they show us about how these two political parties are aligning themselves with the middle class requests?
Can I answer that, or yeah? Because I think there is a really interesting policy debate to be had between the PSDB and the PT about how to be competitive. But it's extremely muted, because each party has reasons not to be totally candid about what their proposals are. So if they each looked at East Asia, for example, the PSDB view of East Asian industrialization would be what they got right was essentially that they had fiscal discipline and they exported. They subjected their companies to market forces, and so they had export-led development. I think the PT view of East Asia is what they got right was industrial policy and developmentalism. That they had different, for example, credit was parceled out with different prices. They did not have the idea that world market prices would guide industrial policy. They actually had a strong state that reserved certain sectors for their own companies, and they intervened. And that's a really important policy debate. How do you maintain Brazil's competitiveness, especially its industry? I think PSDB would say you have to subject the country to market forces. You have to open up and have a competitiveness shock, a bit like what Mexico went through when they joined NAFTA. And you have to let the chips fall where they may. That's a hard case to make in a democracy, because you're talking about restructuring. You're talking about people temporarily, at least, becoming unemployed, and you're talking about fiscal discipline and spending less money at the state level. For the PT, if they were that frank about their developmentalism, they might scare the markets. The markets don't want to hear about developmentalism. They want to hear about market openness to market forces. So I think each party they're not really open about what they see as the solution. And, I think they can each take elements of the East Asian experience and say that shows that we're right. I'm not dogmatic. I mean, I don't believe ideologues on these issues. I think you have to look at specific cases and specific examples of what you can do. So, and I think we are in new territory. We're post 2008. We're in an area where there are clearly serious problems with a purely market-oriented approach. If you looked at the financial crisis of 2008, what was shocking to me is that people who bet against the subprime market in the States made huge amounts of money, but people who bet in favor of subprime mortgages also made huge amounts of money. So there's a misalignment of incentives in financial markets that's a serious problem. So I think you can't just blindly, tie yourself to the mast of absolute openness in terms of market forces. But then the question becomes, post-2008, so what is the role of the state? How do you have developmental policies that are not wasteful and not inefficient, that don't just create barriers for uncompetitive industries to carry on beyond their natural life? And that's a serious issue. I don't know if anyone has easy answers on that. But it's a shame that the debate isn't out there in the presidential campaign. I agree with you. It's not there.
And I'd say
if I may add just one more question for you specifically, because you said that foreign policy wasn't as present in the debate. So I just want you to comment a little bit on what Dilma has been saying, that the opposition would end Mercosur, or threaten Brazil's position in South America, in addition to what you were already planning to say.
Okay. Now, if you go to Brazil and you watch the debates, you'd see that there are three issues that are always covered: health, security, and education. It seems that the country does nothing besides this item. These three items is discussed. So, and the way the format the television does, each candidate asking each other, is not a good one. because they basically ask things that they can point out what are the advantages that they have in their plans. Now, it turns out so that the political debate in Brazil is very poor. Also, by the way, it's done through the television, the TV channels, and all this. It's nothing, it's not really, you're not pushing the candidates to find out what the positions are. Now, the other challenge is that the candidates in Brazil have not registered. They have been releasing their governmental plans, but steadily, Aécio is doing that online, Dilma hasn't done that. So we really have no idea where these guys want the country to go, really. And that's a major problem when it comes to knowing what the future of Brazil is like. Brazil is I love the country, but I think we do some things that are strange. We don't scrutinize our candidates. Now, if you look into the American elections and what they do with their candidates, Brazil doesn't do anything like that. So we basically elect people based on a small track record, and we don't care we don't ask them their ideas about everything. So, and it's very easy to cover all the issues because our election cycle is only of 80 days. It's not like you have to be a candidate for 2 years and to get the candidate, nominated by the party and all that. It's an 80-day campaign, and it's very little time for you to know what the people really think. Now, one issue that has happened in Brazil right now is because of these corruption scandals, the political parties have much less money. So the campaigns have been poorer than in the past because there is less money and people are concerned about donating money to the candidacies. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, I say it's not an issue because if you check the candidates, they haven't asked each other about foreign policy. We do need to solve some problems, right? We need to find out what will be our alignment in the future in relation to the Castros, to the Kirchners, or to Maduro, right? People will start questioning our leadership role in Latin America, particularly the Mexicans. They say, hey, you are having problems there, but we need to change that. We do see that Dilma has been distancing herself from Venezuela. It's not the same relationship that Lula had with Chavez, and it's not as close, and we have slowly getting farther and farther away. But we did decide to support the Castro family. No, the government decided that by bringing foreign Cuban physicians to Brazil and paying the government. So Brazil has made these strange ideological decisions. Again, I believe that a second-term president is more concerned about the legacy and foreign policy should become a more important and more relevant issue for her. Now, the problem is the ideology behind some of these decisions. So the difference there is that I think Aécio could be a little bit more flexible ideologically, even though I do not see too much of a change in the two candidates when it comes to foreign policy.
Antonio, I was interested in what you said about what would happen after the election. And, I suppose I can kind of imagine if Dilma wins, you'll get a similar sort of government with the PSDB and the other coalition parties, some fresh faces, but it'll be kind of more of the same. What I can't imagine, being this far away, is what it would look like if Aécio won. What sort of government would he have, and how would he govern in Congress, for example? How would this work? What do you think?
If I may, I think he will bring back some folks from the time that Fernando Henrique was the president, or some of them will resurrect, I'd say. Even though Rubens Barbosa, who was ambassador here, could be, rise again, and he could be, like they said, that he could be the next Minister of Foreign Affairs. We do see that he resurrected Arminio Fraga. So we might see some folks coming from the past. Now, I don't think that he will be able to do very much, because after 12 years in power, PT has basically controlled the whole government. Until Aécio has time to find 20,000 people he trusts to put in government for the positions in Petrobras and all that, so I think it'll take him like 1 or 2 years. The problem I see, Ambassador Charlton, is that since we do not know the plan exactly that he wants to follow, we do not see how he can implement it. Because if he wants to make changes, he needs to start working from day one. And if he's going to, basically deconstruct, destroy everything that was done by the Lula administration when it comes to the government, not to the programs. He already said that he's going to keep many of the programs. But if he's going to deconstruct the machinery, the political machinery that has been built, it's going to take him a little while. And if he doesn't have a clear path of what he wants to do, then I think, he could waste like the whole first term trying to make the adjustments that are necessary for the country to grow and to pick up and start developing again. Same thing would happen if, any new guy that arrives in Venezuela, he has to start, building a new government from zero, and has to get rid of all the Chavez and all the Chavez inheritance. Now, we do see that he's going to bring some market names, people from the market, and he wants that to be a major difference. He was a good governor in the state of Minas Gerais. He did what he called the management shock for the state of Minas Gerais. Now, whether he will be able to reproduce that at the federal level is a whole different story, because Minas Gerais was under his belt for a long time. Now the federal government's under the PT belt, and it'll take a little while for him to make the changes.
Oh, just a note, one estimate that I was seeing in the press was that the opposition to AECO in Congress would be reduced to about 104 deputados, PT, PCdoB, PDT, and PSOL. Everyone else, this is the beauty of the Brazilian system. PMDB just jumps into bed with whoever wins the presidential election. So I don't see any problem with him governing in Congress. He's got 20,000 appointments to make at the federal level. That's another thing that can make it work. The one thing I would look at is if he's talking about fiscal, downsizing fiscally, but he wants to maintain a coalition with lots of parties as members, there's potentially a tension there, because only about, more than 80% of the federal budget is non-discretionary. It's debt service, it's transfers to state and municipal, and it's pensions. So there's not a lot of wiggle room. If he's really going to cut and get spending under control, and he wants to manage a big coalition, there's some painful trade-offs there that he might have to make. So that's what I would look for in an AECO government, is how is he going to manage that delicate balancing act of having enough support in Congress, but at the same time not spending so much to maintain the coalition.
Now, if he loses Petrobras as a tool for politics, as a result of the scandal now, then this managing getting people into the alliance is going to be a little bit more difficult.
One last tool to...
Political parties only think about the elections. And when they think about elections, they think about the money for the elections. Now, if you're killing the cash cow, which was Petrobras, how is he going to be able to, get the majority back again? Because, in politics, money does play an important role.
And jobs as well, right?
Yeah.
Chris, and then...
A quick question, looking to the future, how do you see, we've been talking a lot about the federal government, but what's that relationship in the future going to be like with the state governments, the larger municipalities? I'm always struck by their kind of strength for, Sao Paulo says it has its own foreign policy, for example. Mm-hmm. How do you see that kind of balance changing?
Well, there is a movement that we call that paradiplomacy in Brazil. And I do not see... I think that an interesting thing that has happened in Brazil is that as a result of globalization, we have understood slowly that Itamaraty should not be the only source of foreign policy for Brazil. Here in the UK or in the US or elsewhere, you do see think tanks, the academia, participating in designing foreign policy. In Brazil, for a long, long time, was the exclusive domain of Itamaraty. Now, I think that the fact that Brazil is in the center stage of the world because of BRICS and all that, I do think that Itamaraty will keep playing the role it has, but not as intensively as it was in the past. It needs to be redesigned for the new role that Brazil has right now and will have in the future. I always said that Brazil was when BRICS was created, Brazil was put on center stage, the curtains open, and then we found out that we were just cleaning the place, right? And now people started asking reform, and we had to start doing things, and we did stupid things, Iran, we did stupid things with Honduras, but it's a learning process for the country. Now the states are also trying to engage in diplomacy, and particularly, I heard that from the Americans, they want to engage more with São Paulo because they're having problems with the federal government. But there is so much that the state can do, because if you look into the Brazilian system, we're a federal system on paper, right? On paper, a federal system, but many of the decisions are made at the federal level. So we do see states being more active. I do not see we becoming like Canada and the provinces of Quebec being more independent. I do not see that happening, at least in the near future.
Just a quick note. I think it is a hard country to govern. One thing that struck me was the number of governorships that each of the PT and PSDB won in the first round. And if I'm not wrong, I think it was PT won outright in the first round in Acre and Bahia, and PSDB won in São Paulo and Paraná. But that's it. It's such a low threshold for parties that you can be Levi Fidelix and you can get one seat in Congress and you can run for president and you can get federal money and you can wheel and deal. You're sort of a player in that system. So it does seem, although it is, compared to some federal systems, it's relatively centralized. In terms of party fragmentation and coordination of municipal, state, and federal, it's quite complicated. I mean, education is a good example where each branch has responsibility for one part of the education system, which doesn't seem ideal. So it seems really complicated to govern in Brazil.
Now, PT won in Bahia, Minas Gerais, and Piauí.
Oh, Minas, sorry.
Yeah, Acre is still for taking.
Sorry. So Minas, Bahia,
Piauí,
and
Bahia.
Sorry.
Interesting that PT actually won the state of Aécio Neves.
Yeah. But they
in the first round.
They won the first round, but they didn't win outright, right? I think in Bahia they won outright.
It's taken already.
Sorry?
Minas Gerais is already on the PT.
Oh, they got it. Okay.
Yeah, they got
Bahia,
it.
Minas Gerais, and Piauí.
We had another question there.
Yes. The question is, I think Marcus mentioned about how little difference there is in the program between the PT and the PSDB, but international media wants to see Aécio Neves as the champion of the free market, as a liberal leader. We know that actually what Fernando Henrique Cardoso did back in the 90s was to do the macroeconomic stability of the country. That has been achieved now. So what people are waiting is for the so-called structural reforms, tax, labor reform, pension reform. But by checking on the different debates between the two candidates, no a single thing in that respect has been mentioned. So if we assume that Aécio Neves wins the election, as the international media consider them a free market, how is it that he hasn't mentioned actually anything about the structural reform? Nonetheless, we still want to believe that Aécio Neves is going to be better. For example, on oil policy, how different would be Aécio Neves from Dilma in running Petrobras? Will he change the policy on oil? So basically we are taking for granted that because of the history of PSDB and the Cardoso, we assume it's going to be pro-market, but when you listen to the proposals from Aécio Neves, there is nothing specifically about this structural reform. So what is going to happen in hypothetical presidency under Aécio?
I'll ask the speakers to be kind of quick because we're running out of time.
Okay.
Sorry.
Now, let me tell you one thing that I think is interesting, is that I think that the one who could made the major political reforms in Brazil was Lula. Now, Lula decided not to use his political clout to make the adjustments in Brazil, which is unfortunate, and that's why he's not considered a statesman, because he could have done that, and he didn't. Now, what you do see is that Dilma, after the June manifestations, has basically been pushing for a constitutional reform, which is something that Aécio Neves hasn't discussed. Now, we do know that many of these reforms that you've been talking about do depend on a major constitutional reform. And she is the only one that has been saying this. But the concern is that, okay, is it a constitutional reform based on the ideology of your party and your ideology or not? So that's the whole issue and the whole discussion that she was trying to push right after the manifestations in June. She said, okay, we have to do a political reform. But unless this happens in Brazil, many of these issues are going to be under the table and will be postponed because it requires a lot of political capital. And I do not see in any of the candidates the willingness to really go after this.
Yeah, I agree with Marcos on that. I think there's a disconnect between the political incentives that you have as a politician and the economic incentives. I mean, Aécio talked about the marco regulatorio, rethinking the pre-salt regime and diminishing the role of Petrobras, but he hasn't really made any specific promises on that. He's been somewhat vague. The same with labor reform. He talked about reform of the labor system, and then he went to the trade unions and said, I'm not going to take away anybody's rights. And I think labor reform has been one of the most difficult reforms to do all throughout Latin America, because you build in constituencies who want that system, who want the labor courts and the protections they have. I think tax reform is fundamental. I'm not sure we would get it in a new government. And also just, macroeconomic changes to bring down the interest rate. I mean, that's one of Brazil's serious problems, such a high interest rate. That makes it very difficult for productive investment to be made. Because why do productive investment if you can just speculate and make much more money on high interest rates? So I think it's partly a question of, how do you go to voters to sell them on these difficult structural issues when it's easier to avoid the issues and just sort of muddle along.
Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time. We have a few seconds left, so I'll reserve that for me. Just to say thank you very much, join me in thanking our speakers for the excellent presentation.